The oxygen masks dropped at 37,000 feet. It wasn't supposed to happen this way. Flight attendant Morgan Taylor had performed the safety demonstration hundreds of times. The routine motions, the practiced smile, the assurance that such measures were merely precautionary. But on that January morning, as Delta Flight 2718 crossed over the Rockies, the cabin pressure alarm blared without warning, and what had always been rehearsal suddenly became reality. "I remember thinking this can't be happening," Morgan would later tell investigators. The masks swung down like pendulums, and for a split second, nobody moved. It was as if time stopped, and then chaos erupted. Welcome to Surviving the Skies, where we examine the most harrowing incidents in aviation history and the remarkable stories of those who lived to tell them. I'm your host, and today we're delving into the extraordinary events of Delta Flight 2718, a routine domestic flight that turned into a nightmare at 37,000 feet. On January 17, 2023, 178 passengers boarded Delta Flight 2718 at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport, bound for Atlanta-Hartsfield-Jackson. The Boeing 767-300ER was captained by veteran pilot James Harrison, with First Officer Samantha Rodriguez serving as his second-in-command. Both had spotless records with over 20,000 combined flight hours between them. The weather that morning was clear, with light turbulence expected over the Rockies. Nothing unusual for a transcontinental flight. Pre-flight inspections had revealed no mechanical issues. The aircraft had undergone routine maintenance just 3 days prior. By all accounts, this would be an uneventful journey from the Pacific Northwest to the heart of the South. Rebecca Wheeler, a college professor traveling to a conference in Atlanta, settled into her window seat in row 23. "I remember joking with my seatmate about how I always brought too many books for flights. If only I'd known what was about to unfold, I might have packed differently." The first 2 hours of the flight proceeded normally. Flight attendants served beverages, passengers dozed or worked on laptops, and Captain Harrison maintained a steady course at cruising altitude. At 10:42 a.m. Mountain Time, First Officer Rodriguez noticed something odd. "We observed a minor fluctuation in the cabin pressure reading," Rodriguez would later testify at the NTSB hearing. "Initially, it was within normal parameters, nothing that would trigger immediate concern. Captain Harrison and I discussed it briefly and decided to monitor the situation. Within 7 minutes, that minor fluctuation had transformed into a critical situation." Flight attendant Lisa Michaels was in the rear galley when she first noticed the change. "My ears started popping, but more intensely than usual. Then I felt a slight lightheadedness. That's when I knew something wasn't right." In the cockpit, alarms suddenly blared as the pressure differential exceeded safety thresholds. Captain Harrison immediately initiated emergency protocols, deploying the oxygen masks and beginning a rapid descent to reach breathable air. Descending to 10,000 feet, Harrison radioed to air traffic control, declaring an emergency due to cabin depressurization. For the passengers, the moment was surreal. The overhead compartment snapped open, releasing the yellow oxygen masks that dangled before their faces. The aircraft tilted forward sharply as Harrison executed what's known as an emergency descent, a controlled but rapid drop in altitude designed to reach breathable air as quickly as possible. Thomas Grant, a former Air Force pilot who happened to be aboard as a passenger, recognized immediately what was happening. The dive was steep, steeper than anything you'd experience in normal flight. Items that weren't secured were flying through the cabin. People who hadn't managed to secure their masks were struggling for air. Some were crying, others praying. At such altitudes, consciousness fades quickly without supplemental oxygen, as little as 30 seconds of useful consciousness at 35,000 feet. Time was of the essence. In row 15, Emma Russo, a nurse from Portland, sprang into action when she noticed an elderly man struggling with his mask. His hands were shaking too badly to pull it over his face, she recalled. "I just reached over and helped him secure it, then checked that his daughter next to him had hers on properly too." Throughout the cabin, Flight attendants moved as quickly as possible through the aisles, assisting passengers while fighting against the lack of oxygen themselves. Morgan Taylor, despite feeling the effects of hypoxia, managed to help 3 children whose parents had passed out before securing their own masks. Training kicks in, she would later explain. You don't think about yourself. You think about the passengers who need help. As the aircraft descended through 25,000 feet, the air became more breathable, though the plane continued its rapid descent toward 10,000 feet, the altitude at which supplemental oxygen is no longer required for most individuals. But the depressurization was only the beginning of Flight 2718's troubles. At 11:03 a.m., Captain Harrison leveled the aircraft at 10,000 feet and began assessing their situation. The pressurization system had failed completely. While they could maintain flight at this lower altitude, continuing all the way to Atlanta was no longer viable. They would need to divert. Denver is our best option, Harrison told Rodriguez. We'll be on the ground in 20 minutes if we push it. Air traffic controller Michael Thompson received their transmission and immediately cleared all traffic to create a path for the distressed aircraft. When an emergency is declared, everything else becomes secondary, Thompson later explained. Every second counts. As Harrison and Rodriguez prepared for their approach to Denver International Airport, another alarm sounded in the cockpit. We've got a hydraulic pressure drop in System A, Rodriguez announced, her voice remaining professional despite the escalating crisis. Modern commercial aircraft typically have 3 hydraulic systems, A, B, and C, that operate critical flight controls. Losing one system isn't catastrophic, but it does reduce redundancy and complicates landing procedures. Denver approach, Delta 2718, Harrison radioed. We're declaring an additional emergency. We've lost hydraulic system A, requesting priority landing and emergency service on standby. In the passenger cabin, the mood had shifted from panic to an uneasy calm. With the oxygen masks no longer necessary at the lower altitude, people could communicate again. Some held hands with strangers. Others sat in stunned silence. Rebecca Wheeler remembers the surreal quiet. It was like being in the eye of a hurricane. We'd just been through this terrifying descent, and now everything seemed too still, too quiet. But you could feel the tension. Everyone knew we weren't out of danger yet. Captain Harrison's voice crackled over the intercom, steady and measured. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We've experienced a pressurization issue and a hydraulic system malfunction. We're diverting to Denver International Airport, where we'll be landing in approximately 15 minutes. Our aircraft is designed with multiple redundant systems, and we can land safely with the systems we have operational. I need everyone to listen carefully to the flight attendants who will be preparing you for an emergency landing. The flight attendants began moving through the cabin, instructing passengers to review the safety cards and preparing them for a potential evacuation after landing. They demonstrated the brace position and ensured all loose items were secured. In Denver, emergency response teams assembled on the tarmac. Fire trucks, ambulances, and airport safety personnel formed a corridor of flashing lights along the runway designated for Flight 2718's arrival. At 11:27 a.m., Flight 2718 began its final approach to Denver International. Without the full hydraulic system, the landing would be more challenging than usual, requiring manual adjustment of certain controls and careful management of the aircraft's speed and angle of descent. Gear down, Harrison commanded as they descended through 3,000 feet. Rodriguez pulled the landing gear lever. 2 green lights illuminated, indicating that the main landing gear had deployed successfully. The third light, representing the nose gear, remained dark. Nose gear indicator negative, Rodriguez reported calmly. Harrison acknowledged the information without breaking his concentration on the approach. We'll proceed with the landing. Alert the cabin crew to prepare for a possible nose-down landing. Through the cabin intercom, Morgan Taylor's voice remained remarkably steady as she delivered news that no passenger ever wants to hear. Ladies and gentlemen, we may have an issue with our landing gear. Please assume the brace position when instructed and remain in that position until the aircraft comes to a complete stop. In row 23, Rebecca Wheeler turned to her seatmate, a businessman named Paul, who had barely spoken during the flight. "I guess we'll have quite a story to tell, won't we?" she said, attempting to lighten the mood. Paul managed a tight smile. "I was supposed to have dinner with my daughter tonight. First time I've seen her in months." "You'll make it," Wheeler assured him, though she wasn't certain of that at all. As the aircraft descended below 1,000 feet, Harrison made one final transmission to the tower. Delta 2718. On final approach. Possible nose gear issue. All passengers and crew prepared for emergency landing. At 500 feet, Harrison gave the command over the intercom. "Cabin crew, secure for landing." Morgan Taylor's voice followed immediately. "Brace, brace, brace." Throughout the cabin, passengers folded forward, heads down and hands clasped behind their necks, as they'd been instructed. The main landing gear touched down at 11:31 a.m. with a squeal of rubber on concrete. Harrison held the nose up as long as possible, using the elevator controls to delay the inevitable moment when the front of the aircraft would make contact with the runway. As the plane's speed decreased, the nose began to drop. In the cockpit, Harrison and Rodriguez watched tensely, uncertain whether they would feel the jolt of the nose gear engaging or the horrific scrape of metal on concrete. The nose dropped lower, and then settled with a firm bump. The nose gear had deployed, after all, despite the indicator failure. A spontaneous cheer erupted throughout the cabin as passengers realized they had landed safely on all wheels. Emergency vehicles raced alongside the aircraft as it taxied to a stop, their lights casting red and blue reflections across the fuselage. But the ordeal wasn't quite over. "I smell something burning," a passenger in the first row reported to flight attendant Lisa Michaels. Within seconds, wisps of smoke began to appear near the forward galley. The source wasn't immediately apparent, but with a potential fire on board, there was only one appropriate response. "Evacuate! Evacuate!" Morgan Taylor shouted, initiating the emergency evacuation procedures they had reviewed just minutes earlier. The emergency slides deployed at all exits as flight attendants directed passengers to remove high heels, leave belongings behind, and exit rapidly. "Jump and slide! Jump and slide!" they called out at each exit, ensuring passengers moved away from the aircraft after reaching the ground. Emma Russo, the nurse who had helped her seatmate with his oxygen mask earlier, found herself assisting an elderly woman down the slide. "She was terrified of jumping, but I just held her hand and said we'd go together. Sometimes all people need is to know they're not alone." All 78 passengers and 7 crew members evacuated the aircraft in under 90 seconds, well within the FAA requirement for emergency evacuations. As the last passenger slid to safety, fire suppression foam covered the nose of the aircraft where electrical components had overheated. On the tarmac, airport emergency medical teams evaluated passengers for injuries. Remarkably, only 12 required treatment, primarily for minor cuts, bruises, and one broken wrist sustained during the evacuation. No one suffered serious injuries from the depressurization or the landing itself. In the terminal, as passengers gathered in a designated area for processing and assistance, Rebecca Wheeler found herself standing next to Paul, the businessman worried about missing dinner with his daughter. "Looks like you might make that dinner after all," she said. "Maybe a bit delayed, but you'll have quite a conversation starter." For the first time since they'd met, Paul smiled genuinely. "I think I'll hug her a little longer than usual tonight." The investigation into Delta Flight 2718's series of malfunctions would continue for months. NTSB investigators would eventually trace the initial depressurization to a subtle manufacturing defect in an outflow valve, one that had gone undetected through multiple inspections. The subsequent hydraulic failure was determined to be unrelated, a rare coincidence that complicated an already dangerous situation. Captain James Harrison and First Officer Samantha Rodriguez received commendations for their exceptional handling of multiple system failures. Flight attendants Morgan Taylor and Lisa Michaels were recognized for their exemplary performance during both the depressurization and the evacuation. For many passengers, the experience changed their perspective on air travel and on life itself. Thomas Grant, the former Air Force pilot, put it this way: "People often ask if I was scared. Of course I was. But what I remember most isn't the fear, it's the incredible professionalism of that flight crew and the way complete strangers helped each other. That's what kept us alive." Emma Russo returned to her nursing job in Portland with a new appreciation for emergency training. In a crisis, you fall to the level of your training, not rise to the level of your expectations. Those flight attendants demonstrated that perfectly. Rebecca Wheeler kept in touch with Paul, her seatmate. 6 months after the incident, she attended his wedding. "Near-death experiences have a way of clarifying what matters," she explained. Paul reconnected with his ex-wife after the flight. "Sometimes you need a wake-up call to recognize what you've been taking for granted." As for Morgan Taylor, she returned to flying just 3 weeks after the incident. "People ask if I was traumatized, if I considered changing careers. The truth is, this experience reinforced why I do this job. We're not just serving drinks and giving directions to the bathroom. When it matters most, we're there to save lives." That day, we did exactly what we were trained to do, and everyone went home. There's no greater validation of your life's work than that. Flight 2718 now serves as a case study in aviation safety training programs across the industry. The incident highlighted not only the importance of mechanical redundancy in aircraft design, but also the critical role that well-trained human beings play when technology fails. In a world increasingly reliant on automation, Delta 2718 stands as a powerful reminder that in the most critical moments, it's still human judgment, human courage, and human compassion that make the difference between disaster and survival. If you found this story as compelling as we did, please consider subscribing to our channel for more incredible tales of survival against the odds. Your support helps us continue bringing these important stories to light. And if you've experienced a flight emergency yourself or know someone who has, we'd love to hear your story in the comments below. Each account adds to our collective understanding of aviation safety and the remarkable resilience of the human spirit. Until next time, this is Surviving the Skies, reminding you that behind every statistic is a human story worth telling. See you in the next video.